But yeah, I'll keep going.
Cosmological argument, say, as opposed to just the cosmological argument?
It goes like this. Premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise two, the universe began to exist. Three, therefore, the universe has a cause. And then you do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe. And a number of theologically striking properties fall out of such an analysis for this first cause. You can show that this first uncaused cause must be beginningless, timeless, changeless, immaterial, spaceless, enormously powerful, and I would argue personal, which I think is a robust core concept of God.
And I know the approach you...
And I don't know if you wanted to say anything about the stage two bit?
Well, is that all that we're going to get in this video as in terms of stage two? Because, I mean, I disagree with almost every single one of those alleged entailments.
Yeah, I mean, maybe say just a couple of things about why, like, some of those main ones, like, why do you think, I mean, you know, well, surely it's spaceless if it's making space, right? It can't be made of space if it makes space.
Yeah, see, the thing is, the stage one, you have to be very careful with the stage one and what you're actually showing in your argument. If, for instance, you're only showing that in this first stage that the past must be finite, or, you know, time cannot proceed infinitely into the past, then all you're able to conclude there is that, yeah, the past is finite. That doesn't mean that, like, space came into existence at the first moment of time or whatever. There may very well be some sort of space that is causally prior to the beginning of time, and in which the cause of the beginning of time resides. So you just have to be very careful. Like, you don't show that space itself began to exist just by showing that the past is finite. All you show there is that time has a beginning. And so the cause may very well be spatial, even though it is in some sense causally prior to time, because there may be some sort of weird space that's causally prior to time. I don't see any reason for ruling that out. So that, I mean, that's one thing. Another thing is, like, I mean, it doesn't automatically follow that it's timeless. If you show that the past is finite, we're talking about metric time. That is time that can be, like, metricated and divided up into intervals that are, let's say, a certain number of seconds long, certain number of days long, etc. So really what they're showing is that metric time must be past finite if their arguments succeed. But there's this Oxford school that Swinburne, Paget, Ryan Mullins, and others have developed. And they develop this view with respect to divine temporality. And they think that God actually pre-exists the beginning of metric time in a kind of non-metric or amorphous time. And there are actually certain cosmological models that make use of amorphous time. I think Roger Penrose has developed certain models with amorphous or non-metric time. So there might be this beginningless, but not infinitely long, temporal period before the beginning of metric time, and so the cause might even be temporal in that sense. And this, again, notice that this is not an infinitely long temporal period, right? It's non-metric, so you can't, like, metrically divide it up into an infinite past or something like that. There's really just no fact of the matter about how long it is. It doesn't make sense to ask that question because it's not metric. So it's not as though this involves a beginningless, or it's not as though this involves an infinite past. It doesn't involve an infinite sequence of events. It doesn't involve any of these alleged absurdities that Craig and defenders of the Kalam bring up. You know, they emphasize, they bang their gongs about. So it might be temporal. It could easily be temporal. The cause of the universe, the cause of the beginning of time. It might be spatial. Okay. Must it be enormously powerful? No. Why would you think that? All it needs to do is cause some sort of change that kicks off the beginning of metric time.
You don't need to be enormously powerful for that, however powerful that is.
Exactly. All you need to be able to do is cause the first change or something like that. I mean, that could just be some sort of, like, indeterministic decay process of some sort of, like, quantum field or something, and then once that happens, you just kickstart a series of changes, and then bada bing bada boom, you've got metric time up and going. So does it need to be enormously powerful? No, obviously not. You know, when Craig presents this argument, you know, he presents it as, oh, this thing is like the cause of this huge, beautiful universe, and, like, you and me and everything. It's like, I mean, not really. It just initiated the whole chain of events, and you don't need to be enormously powerful to do that. So we've got, it doesn't follow that it's spaceless, doesn't follow that it's timeless, it doesn't follow that it's enormously powerful. Is it personal? I don't see sufficient reason for thinking that it's personal. I mean, one way that Craig tries to motivate that is saying that in order to get a temporal effect from a timeless cause, you need something like a spontaneous free decision by an agent endowed with libertarianly free causal power. Now, it's of course, an interesting question whether or not libertarianly free causal power is even coherent in the first place. We'll set that aside. I'm kind of agnostic on that. But lots of philosophers wouldn't even grant that in the first place. But for me, I just think all you need is, I mean, we haven't even shown that it's timeless. Keep that in mind. But like, all you would need is some sort of spontaneity in causal power, and for me, that can be afforded by indeterministic, some sort of indeterministic cause. So we have perfectly coherent physical models on which we have indeterministic impersonal causation, and for me that affords the kind of spontaneity that you would need in order to get a temporal effect from a timeless cause. At the very least, I don't see any reason for thinking that you would need specifically the spontaneity associated with free will that the spontaneity associated with indeterministic causation does not itself afford. So that is yet another problem. I don't think we get to personhood. Craig also says things like, oh, well, the only this thing has to be non-physical, and the only non-physical things that we know of are like abstract objects and minds. And and it can't be an abstract object because those are causally effete. Therefore, it has to be a mind. Now, this is a very, very poor argument. Firstly, those aren't the only two candidates that we know of. It could be any of a whole concoction of things. It could be like an impersonal Brahman, an impersonal Neoplatonic one. It could be the Tao. It could be some like atheistically construed Thomistic. You know how the Thomistic God is like being itself, purely actual, things like that. You could just construe that impersonally, which a lot of people have alleged Thomism falls into. You could just construe that impersonally. It's just an impersonal, transcendent, simple reality, purely actual reality. There are so many different candidates. It could be a non-spatiotemporal universal wave function that Alyssa Ney and Jill North and various others, and I develop in my my book right up there with Daniel Linford. So it could be it could be whole concoctions of things, and so it's just ludicrously absurd, I think, to say that it could only be, the only candidates are a mind and abstract objects. The second thing to say there is that at least some philosophers have defended that some abstract objects might not be causally effete. So that's something that they'd have to contend with. And then the third thing to say is, like, if we're allowed to use this reasoning, like, oh, the only things we know of are minds and abstract objects, but abstract objects are causally effete. What I can say is it's either a mind or a non-mind, but the only minds that we uncontroversially know of are embodied minds, and this thing, because it's non-spatiotemporal, etc., can't be an embodied mind. Okay, so we've ruled out the mind hypothesis. It must therefore be a non-mind. That is the exact same reasoning that Craig has gone through. So if one accepts Craig's reasoning, one should equally accept this reasoning that I've just given. And of course, they get contradictory conclusions, namely that it's a mind and it's also not a mind. And so if you should accept the one, you should accept the other, but accepting both leads you to contradiction. So then we should accept neither, I say. So anyway, that's my little spiel about stage 2. I think basically nothing that Craig says follows. Basically nothing follows that he says follows. And I also actually want to say, in addition, this is my final thing before I turn it over to you. Sorry, but all this stuff might come up later on, and I'm on my high horse.
That's cool.
Yeah, I'm on my high horse. So, most of the arguments in the first stage of the cosmological argument only get you to, if they succeed, which they don't, but if they succeed, they get you to a finite past. That is the series of past events, the number of past events, which are equal in terms of their temporal interval, etc., is finite. That doesn't entail that the universe began to exist, because beginning to exist has certain conditions that Craig says have to be met. For instance, it has to be such that it does not exist timelessly without the beginning of metric time. And so merely from the fact that you've established that the past is finite, or that the universe's past is finite, you don't thereby establish that the universe began to exist, because it may very well be the case that the universe, or some part of the universe, or at least some physical object, existed timelessly without the beginning of metric time, and temporally since, which is Craig's precise view of God. Right? So you don't automatically get to the beginning of the universe, even if you establish that the universe is past finite, or that the series of past events is finite. Similarly, Craig grants that this Oxford school that I was talking about earlier with non-metric time He grants that that's like a legitimate, serious, appropriate view for theists to hold. It doesn't make God begin to exist, and so on. In fact, I just interviewed him the other day, and he said precisely that this is a, he very much respects this view, and it's a live option for him. That wouldn't be the case if it made God begin to exist. So another way for you to fail to begin to exist, even if you have a finite metric past, is to pre-exist that finite metric past in a non-metric time.
Yep.
And so even if you establish that the universe has a finite metric past, necessarily has a finite metric past, it doesn't follow that the universe began to exist, because either the universe or some portion thereof or some physical object may very well have pre-existed at the beginning of metric time in a non-metric time, in which case it would not have begun to exist, even though it has a finite past. So there's like a crucial gap in their arguments for the finitude of the past between that and their actual second premise, that the universe began to exist. They don't actually entail that the universe began to exist. And so I think that's utterly crucial. And I haven't seen a successful argument that bridges that gap, at least in my time studying, the Kalam literature and things like that. So that's another point that's worth emphasizing. There's this huge gap in arguing for the universe's beginning. They typically only argue for the finitude of the past, and as I've explained, that is utterly insufficient.
Yeah, and there's another thing which is going to come up, I think. So if the mind that created everything has to be utterly non-physical, obviously that part of the whole point is that it can't be a physical thing. It has to be like a dualist second substance kind of conception of what a mind is. But and it has to be extreme in that sense, right? It has to be possible for it to exist without there being any material substance for it to sort of supervene on or anything like that. Completely distinct substance altogether. But then it's like, hello, interaction problem. Like if there's something as radically divorced from material as that, it's like, how does it even make material? Like, what's that about? Anyway, but we'll see this come back later on. So let's keep going with it.
Right before you do that,
go.
Just one final note. So I mean, there are, as you're rightfully pointing out, like there are rebutting defeater approaches to their second stage and undercutting defeater approaches. The undercutting defeater approaches, as I'm using that term, undercutting defeater, is basically saying that, hey, I'm removing your justification for the relevant conclusion.
Yeah.
I'm saying you guys have not sufficiently justified this. Why can't we think that it's any of these other candidates that I mentioned, etc.? There's also the rebutting defeater approach, which says, it doesn't say that, the way that you arrived at this conclusion is not justified. Instead, it says the conclusion is actually false, and you give some positive reason to think that the conclusion is false. And so there are, I just didn't even mention like the rebutting defeater approaches. Yeah, I mean, there are potential challenges to timeless to temporal causation. There are potential challenges to the very notion of disembodied minds and disembodied consciousness and non-temporal consciousness. There are challenges. I mean, there are rebutting defeaters here ad nauseum. Whether or not they succeed is a question that, for another day, but we'll probably get onto that later.
Yeah, I'm sure some of this will come back up. All right.